I'm going to log off and log back in real quick, you guys. I think. All right, one more minute. And if you guys want to mute your microphones, so we don't hear, dogs barking, stuff like that. And then if you have a question or you want to say something, just unmute it and speak. So it's 10 o'clock, okay? And I'm still getting used to this Zoom thing. But like I said, totally open for questions, no problem. Just unclick your mic and speak away, interrupt me. That's totally fine. Hi guys. So we're going to pick up. We're probably going to finish Form 21 today. There were a couple questions between Thursday and Friday's session that I'll touch on. We had a question when we talked about delayed possession. And with delayed possession, the question was around how do we use the move in, move out form that is like, it's 65 B or something. It doesn't matter what number it is. And I don't use that form because Form 21 already takes into account and controls the condition that the property needs to be in. And that is with regards to the closing and possession paragraph. And it's specifically line 76 and 77, where it says that seller will maintain the property in its present condition. Present condition is the time of mutual acceptance. So when we draft an offer and get it accepted, that's what that paragraph is referring to. So it's the condition of the property at that time that the seller is to maintain it up until the time buyer is entitled to or given possession. So if the buyer is not going to move in, like I told you, I had a contract where we sold, seller stayed for 2 months. Buyer is not entitled to possession for 2 months after close, but the contract, as I just said, controlled the condition, seller has to keep it in. So there's no need to move out because Form 21 already determines that. Keith, mute your microphone, or I could probably do it, huh? Oh, hey, I can mute you guys. Wow, control. Um, yeah, okay. So that came up. Also, I talked about the new 22 FM. I talked about that either Thursday or Friday or maybe both days, but I'm still getting a lot of questions on it. Or if you missed me talking about it, I'm just going to mute you as you guys come in. Mark, I'm muting you too, but you can always unmute yourself, I think. But FM, force majeure. In fact, I used it this weekend when I drafted an offer. And so that force majeure form, it's pretty straightforward, and it's one page, and it was born about Wednesday last week because of this coronavirus. And the default is an extension of 10 days. You can negotiate any time period, but it's 10 days for any time period, including closing. So we have a 10-day inspection period, and we can't get an inspector lined up. That would trigger the force majeure 22 FM, and that would give us an additional 10 days. So it's fairly straightforward. A lot of people have asked me, well, how would it impact the seller or buyer? I mean, there's obviously going to be room for abuse with that form because maybe the buyer could get an inspection, but just needs more time or something. I don't know. So it's all going to be interesting as it plays out. But understand that 22 FM is in our forms library now. The state suggests that if you have any current contract right now under mutual acceptance, that you consider generating a 22 FM, because there may be issues with delays in closing. So things like that. So existing contracts, consider initiating a 22 FM. If you're drafting a contract now, like I was yesterday, I think, losing track of days in this, I grabbed a 22 FM and had it in my offer. So new offers, consider a 22 FM. You're probably going to do a 22 FM. Existing contracts, consider implementing it now and getting it in your contract. So those were the questions from the past two sessions. So finishing up on Form 21, you guys, we're in the general provisions section, and I'm just muting some people here that came in. Okay. In the general provisions, we're on page 4 on Form 21. And we've gone down to paragraph M, which is a pretty straightforward paragraph. The contract controls all the terms and conditions. So when I see this paragraph, I think of things like, well, the MLS said that the refrigerator was included, and in our contract we did not check the refrigerator box, so the refrigerator is not included, even though the MLS said it was. The buck stops with Form 21 and our addenda. So that's part of what paragraph M is referencing. So just, and as I said the other day, if you want it, write it in. Don't think that something is real property, like a water softener, so I don't need to write that in the contract. Because if you were here in the past, you'll remember where we had one of those situations where they closed and seller removed the water softener, and I think it was about $9,000, and buyer thought, wait, hey, that's real property, that stays with the house. So eliminate the confusion, write it in the contract. And then paragraph O, we've talked on, that defines the default provisions in the event buyer defaults. And we talked about the consequence of leaving that line blank, that line being line 8 on page 1, which defines what happens. Is it forfeiture of earnest money or seller's election of remedies? This paragraph O defines it. And we mostly see forfeiture of earnest money. But I also said the other day, that line we see blank too sometimes on page 1. And so what happens if the buyer defaults and the line is blank where you're supposed to pick forfeiture of earnest money or seller's election? And if you recall, or if you were here, I said, hey, some attorneys say that you don't have a valid contract because to have a valid contract, you have to answer every question that's being asked. Other attorneys say it defaults to seller's election of remedies. Those are both bad consequences. So we just need to slow down and perform at the level of an attorney that we are expected to perform at, and not skip any lines. I always like it when I see forfeiture of earnest money is the default provision and the earnest money amount is 0. Shame on the listing agent for allowing that to occur, because there's really no penalty to the buyer. Okay. Professional advice and attorney's fees, paragraph P as in Papa. They did add a line with the July revisions on that. That starts at the end of line 170. And all it was to reiterate that if we go to court, the prevailing party is entitled to attorney's fees. And so that also includes interpleaders. And that's why this line was added, line 170, just to almost be repetitive, but to also say, hey, even if we interplead, which there's a lot of that going on right now. There are more interpleaders than I've seen in probably 10 years. But that line says, hey, the prevailing party is going to be entitled to those attorney's fees as well, and even in an interpleader. Okay. Okay, turning the page, Form 21, page 5 of 5. This talks about the time periods, and the offer must be accepted by 9 p.m. of the offer expiration deadline. It has a paragraph on counteroffers, and it has in here what we talked about. I'm just going to start saying in the past because I'm going to lose track of days. So we talked about it before. The two things that we can change or add to a contract that does not constitute a counteroffer. That is seller's name, or line 14, page 1, seller's citizenship status. Those can be changed, altered, and they do not constitute a counteroffer. And then paragraph S, I don't think I mentioned this the other day, but in the upper right corner of page 1, Form 21, is the offer expiration date. And I don't believe I asked the question, what if that line is blank? If I draft an offer right now and I send it to you and I do not put a offer expiration date in the upper right corner, page 1, Form 21, when does it expire? Does it expire? And the paragraph that we're on page 5 here, paragraph S as in Sam, tells us it's a 2-day expiration period. So if the line's blank, it's 2 days. And a side note, and I get it with this market.
Turn it down. Do not.
I'll mute you, Kelly. There, I muted you, Kelly. In this market, you know, we'll see some buyer brokers who write offer expiration date to be like today at 5, or, you know, something like that, a really short period. And I get that. It makes sense. I know where you're going with it. But here's the problem. You're not always calling the listing broker to say, hey, you, by the way, I sent you an offer and we put a short expiration date on it because my buyers have to find a house and we got to know what you're going to do. Don't send an offer like, well, don't send any offer, but especially one like that, and then not call the list agent and tell the list agent what you did, because you know, with workloads these days, sometimes we're not seeing emails for a while. And what kind of level of service is that, number one, to your buyer, to not give list agent a heads up, and then maybe that offer never even gets a fair shot because it has expired by the time the list agent even gets to it. So especially now, you guys, we got to communicate to one another. And, you know, as I say in class, the really cool thing about these guys, you know, they're really good at texting and playing games. They also make phone calls, right? So we've gotten away from making phone calls. So just think about that. And don't forget, we can still talk on those things. Okay. Let's see, other things to point out here. Paragraph X as in X-ray, there's a new revision, and they added, it's at line 224, that buyer acknowledges that local ordinances may restrict short-term rentals of the property. So these are for those buyers looking to buy properties for Airbnb and things like that. Some areas now are not allowing these things to happen. I don't know if there's anybody on the call here from Walla Walla, and I teach in Walla Walla. In fact, I think I was supposed to be there this week teaching. But in Walla Walla, I have heard that they're no longer allowing Airbnbs. And I don't know if any of them have been grandfathered in or not. I don't know. But that's where a line like this, that's why it was born, because some ordinances are starting to tighten that up. So you don't want to have a buyer buys a house or an Airbnb, we closed, and find out, oh, I can't do it. I can't do it. So that was added to the contract. Is there anything on Form 21, you guys, before we move on to evidence of funds? And I think you can unmute yourself, I think. There's a chat window. Let's see if anybody's talking. Nobody's talking. You guys are all quiet. Okay, so if there's no questions, we're going to move on to 22EF, evidence of funds. And you guys can totally turn your cameras on too, because sometimes it feels a little lonely just talking to my screen and not seeing anybody. Okay, no questions yet. Thank you. All right, got it. All right, 22EF, evidence of funds. So this is one where it was born about 7 years ago, and it created a lot of confusion in reference to contingent funds and non-contingent funds. What the confusion was, and probably still is with some, is that a buyer broker may be under the impression that this makes the contract contingent on whatever funds. Let's say we're getting gift funds from grandma, then the 22EF, they'll think if I use a 22EF, if grandma then doesn't come forward with the money, then the buyer's not in default. And that's incorrect. It doesn't make the contract contingent. It's to identify contingent funds. Paragraph 3 is. So we'll start at the beginning of EF. And paragraph 1 simply defines what we mean by contingent, non-contingent. This also reminds me to tell you or remind you that when you're talking with a buyer and they say, oh, I'm a cash buyer, all that means you got to ask questions, because so many buyers think if I have cash in my 401k or something like that, I'm a cash buyer. You're not a cash buyer. Those funds require disclosures. And again, that's per paragraph A in Form 21, which we talked about before, which says buyer has cash to close and is not relying on any other contingent source of funds except to the extent otherwise disclosed in the contract. So if you don't disclose anything, that means you have cash. So 401k money, you have to disclose that. Paragraph A says you have to. That's not cash. Cash is, I can go to my bank right now and get a check to buy the house. Liquid cash. But home equity line, 401k, I got to sell my boat, that's not cash. So make sure you have those conversations with your buyer when they say, oh, I'm cash. And even if they don't say that, the couple I'm working with now this weekend, they on their down payment, hey, I'm asking them, where's that money coming from? Where is it right now? And then, you know, we got to find out where it is, because if it's contingent, we have to disclose that. So the 22EF paragraph 1 defines that. Paragraph 2 is for non-contingent funds. So I am a cash buyer. I'm going to 200,000 for a house cash. Paragraph 2, if this was in place, would compel me, the buyer, to show you the money, So in drafting an offer, and even a down payment, you could use this money for. In fact, I think we did in our offer, because we just really wanted to stand out. Like, everything is above board. We're showing our cards. But paragraph 2, if I have down payment money, 10%, 20%, $50,000, whatever, buyer broker, one of the options you have is to initiate the 22EF and paragraph 2, which would then compel your buyer to show that they actually have that money. You do not have to initiate 22EF. And if you do not initiate 22EF, you could expect a listing agent to counter with a 22EF, which I've done before. I think it was one where they said they had $100,000 down payment money. Okay, I kind of want to see that. So I had a conversation with my sellers, and we agreed we were going to counter and do so with a 22EF. We want to see the money, right? So buyer brokers, you don't have to do it. Listing agents could come back with it or not. It just depends maybe on their knowledge of this and what their sellers want to do. But paragraph 2 is for non-contingent funds. Now, paragraph 3 is the one that people get all kind of herky-jerky with, because we already know per paragraph A that if I'm getting gift money from grandma, if I have to sell my boat, my plane, a car to buy your house, anything like that, those are contingent funds. And I have to disclose those. I have to. Paragraph A, Form 21 tells me I have to. So this 22EF is a place you could do that, but there's a catch, and you gotta explain the catch to your buyer. The catch is, if, let's say, grandma then decides not to give you the money, you made grandma upset and she's not going to give you the money now. This form was revised a couple years ago, and they added paragraph 4. And paragraph 4 is in reference to paragraph 3. And 4 says, if that money that you've identified in paragraph 3, and in our scenario, grandma's gift money, doesn't come in, you can't get it, and you can't close, buyer, you are in default. And seller is entitled to remedies defined in the agreement, which is Form 21, which is probably forfeiture of earnest money. So that paragraph 4 was created, one, to help you understand it doesn't make the contract contingent. It's just to disclose contingent funds. And also to be clear on, if you identify those contingent funds and you don't get those contingent funds, your buyer's in default. So I know some of you, I already know what you do. And I know what you may be thinking. Well, then if I'm a buyer broker, why would I use 22EF to disclose grandma's gift funds? Because now I'm subjecting my buyer to paragraph 4. Why wouldn't I just disclose it like on a Form 34, right? The 34 sue me form. Why wouldn't I just disclose it on a Form 34? Because 34 doesn't have paragraph 4. And so if I don't get my gift money from grandma, I'm not going to necessarily be in default as I would on the 22EF, right? Does that make sense? Well, if I'm a listing agent, I'm not sure after I'm done talking to my sellers that we're going to be okay with that, because why should my seller take their house off the market for you when you are already saying, hey, I'm getting gift funds from grandma so we can close? If you're not sure about that, maybe I shouldn't be taking my house off the market. And if you are sure about that, then let's use a 22EF. So those are just things you're going to have to talk through, especially with a list agent who knows the forms. And this form has been around now for, I think, about 7 years. So I'm hoping most people know about it. The first 3 or 4 years, a lot of brokers didn't even know this form existed. Question, Marcy, do we have to disclose a down payment? Yeah, thank you for that. I'll get right into that. So that's the argument as far as, well, I don't want to use a 22EF because I don't want to subject my buyer to paragraph 4. Well, you know, we're going to talk about that then, because maybe, like I said, maybe seller's not going to want that. So the question, this is a good question, and this is in my bloopers class as well. We see the problem where the buyer is getting down payment assistance from Washington State, the bond program. That is a loan. Those are contingent funds. So on the 22A financing addendum, you know, if you just write down down payment 5%, and that down payment is really the down payment assistance program, and those are contingent funds. If you just write 5% and nothing else, that means you have that money, whether it's 5%, 50%, $100,000, whatever you put on that down payment, that means you have that money with nothing else being said or disclosed. But with the bond program, we have to disclose that, right? Because those are contingent funds. So somehow, some way, you're going to want to disclose down payment referenced in financing addendum form 22A is coming from, or is, now we're disclosing those are contingent funds, and that is how the buyer would not be in default. And where to disclose that, because that question always comes up. It does, paragraph A doesn't say where you need to disclose things. It just tells you you need to disclose them. So 22EF is a good place to disclose it. But like I implied earlier, you could use a form 34 if you want. You just need to disclose it. But that's a good one, Marcy. Thank you for that question, because yeah, that's a big mistake we make. And as I said, that I put that in my bloopers class because of that. Let's see. How about if discloses in, I don't understand, Marcy, I don't understand that question. How about if discloses in, oh, okay, I do understand the question. So the question is, well, what if in my pre-approval letter, it's disclosed in there? Do I still need it in the contract? How are you going to show that you disclosed this to the seller and seller acknowledged it? They're not signing that pre-approval letter. So, you know, you maybe have 1 foot in the gray where you could line up 50 lawyers and, you know, some of them could probably successfully argue that disclosure was achieved. It was in the offer. You saw the offer. You can't just pick and choose what you see when it was all given to you, you know, that kind of thing. But I would never want to be on that end of the argument. I want to be on the end that it has to be in the contract, because paragraph A says it has to be in the contract, and a loan pre-approval letter is not part of the contract. So I say, no, Marcy, that would not work in the pre-approval. Put it in the contract. Any other questions, you guys? Oh, it even flashes. Okay, that's good. Should you use an EF for the bond program disclosure? It's part of financing. So you might have just come in right now. So we just talked about that. You could use the EF to disclose those contingent funds coming from the down payment assistance. We have to disclose it. We have to disclose it. So now you just decide where. Again, because paragraph A doesn't dictate where, it just says it has to be disclosed in the contract. So whether it's the 22EF, whether it's a Form 34, whether you write it on 22A where it says other and you write it in there, it has to be disclosed. Remember the threshold for whether or not something will stick or something is legitimate. And that is, if you take your contract to a disinterested third party, and I always say, think of a lawyer or a judge, but if you take it to a disinterested third party and you give it to them, will they be able to understand what buyer and seller agreed to? And so again, if I write the disclosure in the EF, the 34, or the 22A, would a disinterested third party be able to see that and say, yeah, you clearly disclosed it, and a reasonable person would have understood that. But yes, it is part of the financing, but it's contingent funds. And again, if I put 5% on my down payment line on 22A, that means I have that down payment money. I have it. And in this case, I don't have it. It's a loan, so I have to disclose it. And I hope that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to close. Any other questions? Okay. I'm getting used to this like dashboard thing. Things are flashing and flying. And so if I miss something, just keep doing it. Okay. Okay. 22EF. This is worth mentioning because we're still in a pretty aggressive market. I don't know. I get this offer. We give them a full price offer yesterday, and house has been on the market for a couple months, went through 2 price drops, and then I'm waiting for the offer to come back signed. Gave the seller everything they want. Seller's freaking out about buying another house and pulled her house off the market. So I don't know what is in store for us with this market, but paragraph 3 on 22EF, this was happening, and it started happening on the west side of the state when they were really crazy hot, where they're getting 50 offers, $100,000 over asking. They're desperate to be picked as a buyer. But if they had a house to sell, where we would normally use the 22B, buyers were opting to not use a 22B, but you still have to disclose that you have to sell that house to buy your house, right? They were using the 22EF, paragraph 3, second line down, sale of the following owned by buyer. They were using that to disclose that they had a house to sell. So by doing that, you are accomplishing the correct disclosure requirements. You're just not taking any of the safety provisions that 22B has in place for the buyer. So that's an aggressive move. Make sure your buyer understands completely the risks associated with doing it that way. I would have that conversation documented. Whether it's a verbal conversation, I would document it, or email conversation, and I would have that in material communication, no doubt about it, in my transaction file, so that later, if something goes wrong, buyer's going to try to throw you under the bus, you'll have the communication from earlier that said, no, we talked about that, and you chose to disclose you had to sell your house on an EF. But we were seeing that, and that's okay. What we don't want, and this happened to me as a list agent, it's a house about 7 months ago. I sold 3 times in a weekend, and legally. And one of the offers had a 22B and a 22EF. And I'm like, And come to find out, because I asked it was a husband wife. I asked them, hey, why both? And they said the 22EF was to disclose that they needed the funds from the sale of the house noted in the 22B. And this was somebody with, he has probably 30 years experience, and she probably has about 10 years experience. And so we don't want to do that. And I was in a funny position because I couldn't really coach him. So I told him, go to your broker and ask your broker what you should do. But we are not moving forward until this gets resolved. Now, of course, I still had to present to my seller, but we're not moving forward with the wrong forms being used. Now, they got a little defensive with me. And so instead of, you know, I'm not going to engage. I just asked them, if your buyer cannot sell the house, what happens to the earnest money? And I never heard from them again. And those are conflicting terms. The 22B says buyer's entitled to the earnest money. The 22EF says seller is entitled to the earnest money. That's what we call conflicting terms, which we can't have in a contract. So I was trying to lead them to discovery, to see the error of their ways. And then since then, I've seen it a few more times where buyer brokers are using both the 22EF and the 22B for the same money. Now, if it's for different money, you know, I got to sell my house and I'm getting a loan or whatever, totally fine, but not for the same money. Don't use that. Questions on that, you guys? I think we finished EF. Let's see. I don't see any questions in the chat. Nobody's clicking their mic. Okay. But one last comment. As a listing agent, you guys, I would probably at least talk about the EF with your seller and use it more than you're doing now, because over the last couple of years in this market, we are really truly being held to the standard and care of an attorney. And so just to ask yourself, would a lawyer do that? If the buyer says they have this much money for a down payment, would a lawyer come back with an EF to say, that is awesome, prove it? And I think a lawyer would. Let's see, hang on. Okay, so the question, not to beat a dead horse, but doesn't the EF paragraph 3 and 4 conflict with bond program in 22A? Buyer would be penalized if bond program doesn't perform. If you use the 22EF to disclose the bond money, you are absolutely correct. Buyer would be penalized if then they don't get that bond, if they don't get that money. So, but we have to disclose it. We absolutely have to disclose it. And why? Again, because that down payment line on 22A, that means you have it. It is liquid cash down payment. You have it right now at the bank. And if you don't, which in a bond program, you don't, you have to disclose. And if you do it via the EF, paragraph 4 would come into play if then buyer doesn't get that loan. We beat dead horses all the time. That's okay. Okay. I don't see anything else flashing at me. Okay, moving on. And if you think of something later, throw it at me. 1036. Okay. I wanted to just go over Form 50 and Form 51. Form 50 is the authorization to disperse earnest money, and Form 51 is the rescission agreement. We are using these wrong all the time. And what I mean by that is we are rescinding when we should be terminating. And furthermore, we don't know the difference between a termination and a rescission. In most cases, you are terminating an agreement. You are not rescinding an agreement. So for example, probably the most common event which would result in terminating would be disapproval of the inspection. Disapprove the inspection and terminate the contract. It says that in 35R that is terminated. So, but then what we do, here's our 35R, we then grab a 51 rescission because we want our buyer to get the earnest money back, and seller has to sign this, and we send it to the list agent. By me legally, contractually delivering the 35R, I've terminated the contract. So if I'm also sending a 51, a rescission agreement, how can I rescind a contract that's terminated? So that's the wrong way to do it, and that's how we're doing it. So if we could do over, it would be a 35R. So think of it this way, you guys. We always have the contract and the earnest money to account for. Contract, earnest money, contract, earnest money. So by delivering the 35R, terminating the contract, I've killed the contract. It's gone. We still have earnest money. So that would be a Form 50, the authorization to disperse money. That's the only thing we have to account for now, because we killed the contract with the 35R. But you see the issue with terminating and rescinding at the same time. And then the argument is, if I send a 51 and the seller says, that's my earnest money, the buyer's not entitled to that, strike, money goes to seller, the contract's not rescinded because you, buyer broker, said, hey, we're rescinding if you accept this. And if the seller strikes the buyer and says money goes to seller, they haven't accepted it, they've countered it, the contract's not rescinded. So to avoid that, and just to do it properly, again, 35R terminates, and now we just have to account for the earnest money. And if I'm a listing agent, that's exactly what I want to do, because I want to get the house back on the market, right? And so if I let you send a 51 and my seller's like, that's my money, man, can I put the house back on the market? If we can't agree on rescinding, the contract's not rescinded. So as a listing agent, I want the 50 and the 35R, because I'll put the house back on the market and buyer and seller can still fight over the earnest money, but we can still sell the house. Let's see here. Yes. Yeah, I see. Yes, I see it all the time too. Jen, thank you. And that is also why that is also in my biggest bloopers and blunders class. So what else? So so the difference, what's the difference? Well, first, when do we rescind? Okay. So termination, 35R. And if we look in the Form 90s, 90, those are all of our termination addenda. So for example, the 90B, 90 Bravo is the seller terminating for buyer's failure to deposit earnest money. Did you know seller can terminate if buyer fails to deposit earnest money when it's due? They can, and that's the 90B. So those are your terminations. Where we see rescissions would be the 22J, the lead-based paint addendum in the cancellation rights, right in the middle of page 1. It says, and contract is rescinded. And we see it in Form 17, seller disclosures, where buyer has 3 business day right to rescind. That's where we see it. Everything else pretty much is a termination. Okay, I'll get to that question, Sue. Let's talk about the difference now. Okay, let's talk about the difference now between termination and rescission. So we achieve mutual acceptance, and now we proceed down our road of escrow. Our inspection, we conduct an inspection, and we disapprove the inspection and we terminate the contract. So we've traveled, maybe here's mutual acceptance, and we traveled 10, 12 days down escrow and we terminate. This portion is preserved. This is, we don't eliminate this. This is preserved. So if there's something wrong with the inspection, the inspector jacked up the house or something where 35 says that they're responsible for it, we hold them responsible for it. So termination just stops at the point of terminating, and everything that has been traveled, the road traveled, is preserved. Rescission, and you probably already know where this is. Mutual acceptance. We travel the road, escrow here. We get Form 17, seller disclosures, and buyer said, no, I don't want the house, and I have a 3 business day right to rescind once delivered. I'm going to rescind the contract. So here's the contract. It's back to the starting blocks. We unwind, we undo the contract. We unravel it, it's back to the starting blocks. That's the difference, if that makes sense. Okay, stand by, let's see. What happens if there isn't any earnest money yet? Say the buyer pulls out during a bump period. Sure, so hopefully, Sue, there's no earnest money and earnest money is not yet due. And so if that's the case, what's the buyer going to do? Okay, I'll go deposit earnest money so the seller can take it. No, there's nothing to do, Sue. If we terminate like on day 1 or day 2 before earnest money's due, we're done. We're done. We're done. And if earnest money was due and has not been deposited, I just hope that, as we talked about the other day, that we have that documented between the brokers, and listing agent has documentation that they have informed their seller that earnest money has not been deposited and is past due, and seller, you have the ability to terminate the agreement. So hopefully that documentation is there if earnest money is due and hasn't yet been deposited. If there isn't earnest money yet. Okay, Jen, what you got here? Oh, I'm sorry, Sue. Let me get the second part of your question. Which form do we use to terminate with? Well, it depends why you're terminating. If you look at the 90s, there's a whole list of reasons to terminate. Jen, all right, yes, and per auditing, as we have had this question from the audit. Oh, don't get me started with auditors. There has to be the correspondence. There has to be the correspondence from you to your sellers in the file that proves you let them know they had an option to get a. Oh, absolutely, Jen. Full on, absolutely. Very big deal with the auditors. I'll touch on it real quick again. I did the other day. They don't mess around, guys. The DOL does not mess around with earnest money. So they want to see that. They want to see who touched it, and so that's where we see the. I'm just going to turn my phone over, man. That thing is lighting up. Where if we've touched the money, a Form 89, and then the earnest money receipt, and on the receipt, it'll say, how did it get there? But we have to be on top of this, and especially listing agents, because here's what the DOL expects is, let's say the earnest money was due yesterday. Let's just say today's Tuesday. Okay, it was due yesterday, a weekday, and we don't have the earnest money yet. The listing agent is expected by the next day, the day after it was due, after 12 o'clock, to be communicating with seller that earnest money has not been deposited and it was due yesterday. Seller, you have the ability to terminate this contract. And again, that's with the 90B. But you have to inform your seller because they don't know this. And that is all in material communication because an auditor will want to see that. Absolutely. So I hope I answered your question, Jen. Haha. Okay, good. I think we're good. I don't see any other chat things coming up. Okay, so, oh, hang on. Yes, you betcha. I can't go over that stuff enough because that is that's the biggest deal. I have audits sometimes where, unless it's a new guy with his supervisor, which was my luck last time, and he had to look at everything. Normally an auditor, their biggest thing is earnest money, when it was due, and date on the receipt. And if it was late, show me the correspondence. So they do not mess around with that. So Form 50 and 51, you guys, what else can I tell you about it? Disbursement of earnest money, Form 50 and 51 is a rescission. Man, I think I said what I wanted to on that. Do you guys, I don't see any other questions. We've got like 12 minutes left. I was going to touch on the escalation addendum in Form 35E. I mean, I can do that, or we can end early. I'll just start talking about the 35E. If you want to bail, you can bail. And then tomorrow I'll pick up with the 35E as though I've never talked about it before. But the 35E, the escalation addendum, is a horrible form, and we screw it up. We're terrible at it. And there's a lot of litigation around the 35E. Then why do we have a 35E? We have the 35E because licensees were holding their breath and stomping their feet, demanding that Northwest MLS create some type of form now known as the 35E. But it stinks. And if you don't believe me, I've been in at least 3 classes over the last 5 years, both in Seattle and in Spokane, where Annie Fitzsimmons will put up a completed 35E and ask, okay, what's the price? And everybody gets it wrong. Now, there was one class where one guy out of like 250 got it right. He later confessed he took the class before and knew the answer. So we screw it up. And where we see litigation is the 35E, the escalation addendum, says you must have a bona fide offer in order to escalate. And there was a case on the west side where they escalated using an offer, but this offer had already expired. So it's no longer bona fide. I talk to closers a lot. I talked to all of them when I did my bloopers and blunders when I was writing that. And this is also in my bloopers and blunders. They say there are times where they don't even know what the price is. They call both brokers and they're getting conflicting answers. So the 35E stinks. Now, you can still use it as a tool, and you can use it to express your buyer's eagerness, but don't rely on it to control the price. So in other words, if you send me an offer with an escalation addendum, you can expect me to generate a Form 36, which is a counteroffer addendum, and whatever price we think we're agreeing on, or I could write in your max price on the counteroffer addendum, and then under that first line where it's just blank, buyer and seller agree, Form 35E escalation addendum is removed from the contract. Because you already told me you'd pay the highest amount for the house. Do you want it still or not? So, side note, make sure you coach your buyer that that could happen to them. And that can happen to them even if there are no other offers that can happen to them, right? Because I can still remove it. And now I don't need a bona fide offer because the 35E no longer exists if buyer signs it. So don't use the 35E to ultimately control the price, because it's a good chance you and the other side might have something different in mind as to what the price is, and or maybe the offer that you use to escalate is not a bona fide offer as defined in the 35E. I've seen multiple times where the sellers counter with the top price on the escalation and then counter removing the 22E, I think 35E. What do you think about this? Oh, you just touched on it. Yeah, Jen, yeah. I've done it, and I've had buyer brokers, cop an attitude sometimes. And then when they're the listing agent, they do it. So the key is to explain the options to your seller and have the seller tell you what to do, right? Don't just say, hey, here's what we're going to do. It'll be fun. let the seller just present the options to the seller and let them tell you what it is they want you to do. Yeah, good. So 35E, what else can I tell you about the 35E? It's a mess. I had, I don't know if, I had a broker call me from the other side of the state around this 35E, and their broker was giving incorrect instructions on how to complete this form. It's a mess. It really is a mess. It's somewhat counterintuitive. So just the takeaway here, you guys, is use it as a tool to express your buyer's eagerness, but remove it from the contract before you guys, don't use it to control the price. Remove it from the contract before you guys achieve mutual acceptance. Does that make sense? Let's see. I see the flashing light again. Great. Yeah, you bet, Russ. Happy to do it. So, gosh, it's 10:53. Is there anything that you guys want me to do in the next couple minutes? For tomorrow, I was thinking, I can just go in order of my class. Next would be the financing addendum. That's just what I'm going to do, unless you guys are like, no, do this. Yeah, you betcha. And I don't know everybody on here. So those that don't know me, the purchase and sales agreement class, which is kind of what I'm going through now. I've been teaching it every month since 2010, which kind of dates me a little bit. But that's my background. I teach it every month to brokers all over. I travel, I teach it to associations all over the state. So that's just kind of what I do. It's one of my passions. Something I learned 2 years ago when I was president of our association, we have a requirement here in Spokane that every licensee has to take this class once every 4 years, which is not even close to being enough. But what I learned is we're the only association with a requirement to take the purchase and sales agreement class. And my issue is with that is our clients think we're experts. They think we know this form inside and out. And I don't think we do. And for those brokers in Spokane that are only doing this once every 4 years, I'm not okay with that because I have brokers with all different levels of experience take my class, and there are takeaways every class. So I really think we got to be better, especially with the disruptors that we're seeing, the Zillows and iBuyers and things like that. We have to really be good at our craft. Otherwise we'll be eliminated. So that's just, I'm lighting up here. Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Great. Hey, you guys are super welcome. Yep, I'm looking for a question. Thank you, Marcy. I missed the first class. This information is great. I don't want to miss future class. There's always something to learn about. Yes, yeah, right on, Anita. Here's the other thing I'm doing. I love you. Left for a while, filled out the EF for the. Okay. These are all being recorded. It only took me like 6 hours to figure out how to make that recording available. Sorry. One thing this time period, this virus thing is resulting in is one, my hands are really clean all the time now. But two, it's forcing me to kind of learn things like Zoom. So what I've done, and if there's an easier way, email me and tell me. These classes I am posting on my YouTube channel so that, because I've had a lot of people say, I had a doctor's appointment, how can I get your class? To me, that just made sense. Like I had to host it somewhere. So my YouTube channel is Mr. Ken Sachs, only because Ken Sachs was taken. He's a Hollywood photographer in LA. So I called it Mr. Ken Sachs. I created it years ago, but I'm posting them there on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and you type in Mr. Ken Sachs, you'll see the channel, my channel, and you'll see these videos there, and you can watch them. So we are at 10:57, and I feel like I missed somebody, but if I did, just reach out to me again. So tomorrow, I guess I'll just go in order like I do when I teach class live. So that'll be 22A financing. We'll start on 22A financing tomorrow, 10 to 11. And pretty much every day it'll be 10 to 11, except for Fridays. It'll probably be 9:30 to 10:30. I will continually put the link out on my Facebook page, our company Facebook page, and wherever else it's going out, so that you guys have that, okay? All right, I have a Zoom call with Washington Realtors in 2 minutes. So any last questions? All right, you guys, stay safe. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you again.